Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm Adrienne Brown. I'm an associate professor in the English department and in the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity, and also the faculty director at Arts and Public Life here at UC. Check us out at Arts and Public Life. Come see a show on the Arts Block. Come hear readings there, too. So I am super pleased to introduce our readers and speakers tonight and to moderate the conversation with Eula Biss and Aisha Sabatini Sloan, writers who I've been reading their work for the last 2 weeks in a kind of concentrated way, and have been kind of imagining myself, or imagining them in conversation, and so it's exciting to have it actually happen. In a recent essay for The New Yorker, Eula Biss traces the difficulties of and possibilities for recovering and sensing and telling the history of private property's origins while searching for glimpses of what we might call, following another thinker of property, literary critic David Kazanjian, a history of anti-possession, social relations that preceded and opposed or opposed dispossession, tracking and imagining how people thrive before, against, or alongside racial capitalist modes of possession and property. In her piece, Biss writes about the figure of the gleaner, a term for peasants who collected leftover crops from fields after they had been harvested for sale. By the 18th century, gleaning was a legal right for many landless residents across Europe. Biss then moves us from historical gleaning to modern gleaners who scavenge in fields and orchards, but also dumpsters and markets. She writes of the gleaner as a salvage artist who, quote, combs the curbsides and makes sculptures out of broken windshield wipers, drawing out the connections between gleaning and art making. I'm interested in how we might understand the different practices of gleaning at play in both Biss and Sabatini Sloan's approach to the essay and to prose, both as they may inhabit the category of the gleaner as a salvage artist, but also in their interest in the history and experience of both the land and of landlessness, what it means to be of, with, for, on, and to claim the land are orientations that end up for grabs across their work in seeking restless and purposefully unanchored ways. They do this as they search, reveal, observe, and bring into form ways of being in spaces, ways of being in space in Detroit and Chicago, in Harlem and in LA, in Alaska, refracted through Lorna Simpson's glacier paintings, and the frontier refracted through Laura Ingalls Wilder's children's books, at Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin compound, but also one's own garden. So we might approach their work as the work of salvage artists, working with pieces of history, works of art, passages of experience, the turn of a phrase, to assemble and make something that doesn't seek to own a topic, but to be near to it and true to it in some way. But I'm also interested in the ways they sharpen our understanding of what it is to glean as a work in and of itself. While the action to glean was originally used to describe the act of gathering ears of corns left behind by reapers, referring to the original work of gleaners, it has taken a more general cast in recent centuries, now more commonly used to mean to, quote, gather or pick up in small quantities, to scrape together, now chiefly with immaterial objects, especially to glean information, to glean experience, but also, quote, to extract information from various sources. How gleaning moved from physical acts of survival for the landless to naming abstract modes of reception, perception, and forms of knowing, I don't quite know. But I do know that this movement in and of itself captures something about the work that Biss and Sabatini Sloan do in their respective writings and practices. Gleaning is a work that both writers are asking us to see and attend to as we look with them looking and looking again, or as we read with them reading and take that looking and reading and turn it into something we can read. We glean from their acts of gleaning, scraping together, collaging, to end up with something more than its parts, more than its reportage, more than its observations. As Aisha writes in her 2022 essay, The Black Shape Slumped in a Chair, Carrie James Marshall and the Taliesin Murders, quote, I have been thinking about the craft of writing while Black and want to find a way to describe the impulse I have to refract, deflect white readers at the same time that I am trying to invite them in. Carrie James Marshall's work has this quality about it. It both invites and deflects. As Eula Biss writes in her 2020 book, Having and Being Had, quote, "These white materials are the product of a white investigation, meaning not only that the investigator herself is white, but that the prime's suspect is a certain kind of white life. There are limits to such an investigation, just as there are limits to what can be learned about the middle class from within the middle class. Even so, my evidence suggests that the stories we tell ourselves about money are full of white lies, not harmless, but white." Here is gleaning that is aware of the racial, economic, and aesthetic history of the work of gleaning itself. A gleaning in constant conversation with what others have gleaned, perpetually keeping in sight the always incomplete, always socially marked work of gleaning itself. And I look forward to what we're going to glean tonight. All right, so I think Eula, you're going to start us off with the reading.
Wow, I'm going to clap for that. Thank you for that incredible introduction, and I'm so excited to enter into this conversation through gleaning. That's a really interesting lens. And I'm just thrilled to be reading with Aisha, whose work I really admire and have been learning from. One of the things I loved about Borealis, one of her recent books, is it's understated humor. It's full of really funny moments. Humor isn't foregrounded in the book. It doesn't present itself as a humorous text, but it's funny throughout. And you said something like that you felt like you were performing stand-up for yourself in that book, yeah. Which is very much how I felt in the early stages of writing Having and Being Had. I was really cracking myself up. And then I wasn't. This book had an interesting process where it went from being like incredibly pleasurable to write and so fun and so funny to me to a really excruciating and painful experience. And I was just realizing that looking through tonight, I was like, oh, there's so many moments in this book that are actually too painful for me to even perform. But so I chose a little like medley of moments that are among the ones that I find funniest. You might not feel the same. And this book is written in a series of like around 80 or 90 very short prose works, and each work is titled. I'm just going to read 4 of them to kick us off. The Right White. I'm taking possession of the house by painting it, every room, and the question of what color in what room is consuming me. I think maybe I should start with historical colors, but I can see the original color of the walls under the layers of chip paint, cloying pink. Maybe memory, not history, is the place to start. Buttered yam from my mother's garden, evening blue, an old bottle half buried in the dirt, forest moss, the color of my mother's little living room, which smelled like wood smoke. Colored Theory, a work in which artist Amanda Williams painted houses slated for demolition on the south side of Chicago, began as a collection of colors. Harold's Chicken Shack red, Crown Royal purple, pink oil, ultra sheen blue, flamin' hot orange, currency exchange yellow. This palette, she says, combines my Ivy League academic training as an architect with my lived sensibility as a South Side native. Each house was painted a single color, from the bricks of the foundation to the shingles on the roof. She painted only houses that weren't worth anything to anyone, not to dealers, not to squatters, not to neighborhood teenagers. Zero value was her term, and she painted those zero value properties in colors drawn from products sold to Black people. Every color, she says, is a code. I'm having trouble finding the right white. I don't like opulence white or Chantilly lace or French manicure. This conversation is boring, my sister complains. Maybe I'll give up on white, I tell her, and paint the living room peach. Peach is problematic, she says, laughing at me now. I've discovered a brand of paint that I can't afford, but I could buy it. To afford something like paint for someone of my class is to announce your values most often, not your financial capacity. I can't admit to valuing paint that costs $110 per gallon, but I find this paint unbearably luminous and undeniably better than any other paint. Even the names are better: matchstick, string, cord, skimming stone. These are not aspirational whites. These whites can afford to be modest. One is even called blackened. I remember the great revelation of moving up from acrylic paints in high school to oil paints in college. First just black and white on paper, and then a full set on canvas. They were worth the expense, those silken oils in their slim metal tubes. I loved all the colors, especially the cadmium orange, which was slightly toxic, flamin' hot. This is the closest I've come to painting in years, shopping for paint. I send a swatch of sulking room paint to Robin, knowing she'll appreciate the name. To sulk in French is boudoir, the source of boudoir, a woman's private room, a room of one's own in a dusty, moneyed pink. And then there's etiquette, a white described as a well-mannered hue. It's a white that's hiding behind its own whiteness. Another line for this white poem. My mind is on paint now more often than poetry. I've found a new literature. Crisp linen, collector's item, white Zinfandel, pashmina, fine china, ivory tower, mirage white, American white. Benjamin Moore has declared simply white the color of the year. This in the year a white man will be elected to the White House. The selection of white as the color of the year was, quote, inevitable, the creative director of Benjamin Moore explains, saying, the color white is transcendent, powerful, and polarizing. It's either taken for granted or obsessed over. I obsess, which solves nothing. Deep in thought is my favorite name for a white, but I don't really like the color. I wouldn't want my walls deep in thought. On my way to a parent-teacher conference, I stop in the hallway of the elementary school to photograph a huge box of institutional toilet paper. The color listed on the label is empathy white. Maybe that's the color I'm looking for. Or a variant, a concerned off-white like all apologies. Or something more revealing like paperwork white or payroll white. Or maybe I should just paint it all property. The piano. The piano arrives with the scent of another house. The scent is not unpleasant. In fact, it smells middle class. And that is what the piano announces once positioned in our dining room. Da-da-da-dum, middle class. Let the lessons begin. We got it on Craigslist, I hear Jay saying, in imitation of me. He doesn't know what this phrase means, but he likes it. We got it on Craigslist, he says of the sandwich I made him for lunch. We got it on Craigslist, he says of the paper airplane he's just folded for a friend. I'm sending Jay to camp for a month so that I can write. A bus picks him up and drops him off every day, and the camp activities include archery and tennis. Sounds expensive, a friend observes. It is expensive, I admit, but it's an investment in my writing. I don't mean investment in the financial sense, as my writing doesn't reliably produce money. The work I do this summer may or may not pay for the camp. I begin my days by practicing piano, which I do badly, but with ardor. Then I read for a while. I write until I'm too hungry to keep writing, and then after lunch, I spend some time in my garden before writing again. I want to also study French, but I rarely do. As I meander my way through one of these days, it occurs to me that my work life resembles the life of an 18th century aristocrat. To confirm this, I consult a book on my shelf, Men, Women, and Pianos. It has chapter headings like Pianos Become a Business, and Music Becomes an Article of Commerce, and The Piano is Furniture. The clavichords of 18th century Germany, I learn, were most often played by women. The instrument was a house furnishing, and they were mostly at home. But those women weren't expected to take their playing too seriously or to make a career of it. The chapter, The Piano as a Female Accomplishment, explains that it was once a mark of class and prestige for a gentleman who by definition did no manual labor to have a wife and daughters who were idle. But it looked more ladylike to do something uselessly pretty than to do nothing. And so, in 18th and 19th century England, as well as in the rest of Europe, young, feminine, genteel idleness was mostly filled with a number of trivial occupations, superficially related to the fine arts. They were known as accomplishments. Both art and women were dismissed as trivial, but the word that bothers me is accomplishment. I don't want, I think, anything to do with it. Still, I pursue it, except at the piano where there's no question of accomplishment. I can't play for anyone else. I've failed to learn the bass clef, and I'm paralyzed by the metronome. Reading the notation takes everything I have, and just 8 measures of Frere Jacques breaks me. But there in the break is a moment of communion between the music and me. This is practice, and practice is all I want out of art. Art. The man sitting next to him at the cafe this morning caught John's attention. There was something about the way he moved that seemed familiar. As John was noticing this, the man turned to him and offered him some coupons for free pizza. "Are you by any chance from the South Side?" John asked. He was. In fact, he grew up a few blocks from where John grew up. This has happened before, when John saw the mother of the new kid at school standing on the other side of the playground and declared with certainty that she was from the South Side, which she was. And when he said hello to the man who lives in the house with the proud Union Home sign on the porch, and the man invited him up for a beer, having recognized that John, too, is from the South Side. The man in the cafe had done some work for the pizza shop next door, and they'd given him the coupons. His work? He was a private investigator. He gave John his card, which pictured a handsome man, maybe him, looking through binoculars. James Joyce, the card read, private investigator. About 60% of his work involved marital disputes, he said, but he would do anything. Last week he'd gone undercover as a woman. A hustler, John says to me now. All us Southsiders are hustlers. He says this with pride and something else, maybe chagrin. I remember my suspicion when I first met John that he was a confidence man. The coupons, I notice, expire today. All artists are hustlers, my mother used to say. We have to be. This was an essential part of my education as an artist, as was The Dead by James Joyce. White Russians. Ivana wants to see the exhibit of early Soviet art, but by the time we get to it, our children are restless, standing too close to paintings, careening towards plinths, and chasing each other around corners. Last night, John and I paid a babysitter $40 so that we could go see I Am Not Your Negro. The theater had a bar, and we ordered 2 White Russians. When the bartender asked what movie we were seeing, John said the one about Baldwin. I asked him why he didn't name the title of the film. It just felt like too much, John said, to order 2 White Russians for 2 white Americans and then top it off by saying, I'm not your Negro. The whites in Russia were opposed to the Reds, the communists. Beyond that, they didn't have a common ideology. They were bourgeois liberals and traditional monarchists and Orthodox Christians. They were from the left and the right. They were patriotic and suspicious of politics. They were whites only because they weren't Reds. I pause in front of El Lisinski's Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, a poster of a red triangle piercing a white circle. It looks so modern, so contemporary, Ivana says. Those stark geometric shapes, radical at the time, are now the language of corporate logos. It's a reminder that revolution needs to be constantly remade, reimagined, maintained. Ivana translates the text of another poster for me, The Enemy Never Sleeps. She grew up with slogans like this, she says, the enemy within. A speech by Lenin is playing from a loudspeaker while his words scroll across a screen in front of us. He's saying things like, we must stop the spread of global capitalism before all the wealth of the world is held by a very few. Well, that seems reasonable, Ivana says wryly. But now that all the wealth of the world is held by a very few, it's no longer a revolutionary sentiment. It's just an artifact in a museum. Our children are whispering to each other and laughing quietly. We're ignoring them, but I overhear enough of their whispering to gather that they're imagining all the damage they want to do to the museum. Jay is describing how he will swing from a hanging light fixture to crash into a painting and then drop to the floor and kick over a sculpture. They're planning a revolt against museums, against boredom, against being kept quiet, against being told what's important. I'm in favor of the revolt in spirit, but I intend to suppress it. There will be no revolution on my watch. I'll stop there.
I had this idea that I was going to read something that relates to the conversation we were having earlier about Harvard and acknowledging relationships to slavery, but I think I might just glance at it real quicker, just to see if that's what I actually want to do, because I do think I want to read from Borealis, but I can't remember where it is in this book, so I might just let it go. Anyway, I have this short piece called, where is it? I'll look at the table of contents. How to prepare to see the royal family portrait, where a colleague and I took some students on this kind of wild goose chase to find like the closest museum exhibiting art by Black artists, and we went on a road trip and we found it, and then we ended up at Harvard to see the Carrie Mae Weems work, and we were reading Yoon Song Kim in the car. Like, my student was so excited about it, we were like, she was shouting it, and we ended up getting to the museum where her work was being featured right before the museum closed, and we were having these weird experiences with the guards. Anyway, I don't remember if it's funny or not, but I'll just read one little bit of it. One red tie sporting docent after another says, 5 minutes left, like a Christo installation. You wander through the rooms, unsure of how you'll know when you've found it. When someone asks you if you need help, you all explain chaotically and simultaneously what you think you're looking for. Somebody points. You run. Stand in front of a portrait of the... This is delivered in the form of instructions. Stand in front of a portrait of the royal family that's royal with 2 L's, who got their money through the slave trade and donated their land to Harvard. Read the placard that says, in essence, we got what we have because we stole and we raped and we murdered. Giggle. Don't be afraid to share your joy with the nearest docent. She is just as thrilled as you are. Exchange high fives with the person standing nearest to you. Walk out of the museum like you just won the Olympics. So that was just on my mind since we were talking about it earlier. But and also I wanted to bring this up because I just found out a couple days ago that this book is going to be republished. So I'm very excited because it went out of print after only 5 years. So I'm excited to see it back. Yeah, I don't really know how to even begin to talk about how surreal it is to be on a panel and then a reading with someone whose influence on my writing life has been so tremendous. But I'm just going to sort of move with it and pretend everything's normal and just keep going, because I also got to do the same thing with John Keane earlier, and that's also mind-blowing. So this book, Borealis, I wrote in response to a prompt from a series called the Spatial Species series, which is a place-based series. And so they asked me to write about a location, and they were like, maybe Detroit or Paris. And I was like, I think I'm going to go back to Alaska because I spent a couple summers there, and I'm really interested in these Lorna Simpson paintings about glaciers, and I'll just figure out what I'm going to write about when I get there. As Eula alluded to earlier, I was very bored a lot of the time, and so I needed to entertain myself. So driving from Anchorage to Homer takes just over 4 hours. As I arrive, I'm listening to an episode of This American Life in which Jelani Cobb talks about the activists from Ferguson who have died mysterious, violent deaths. This listening overlays the coastline and the ice-covered mountains now visible across the pristine bay with burning cars. A woman speaks of death threats while I drive past a sign that says, "Welcome to Homer." Shaggy, off the side of the road, that's a moose. Where exactly have I driven myself? In a gray journal I've jotted down, go back, recreate a space you can't return to. On the plane ride over, 2 white men discuss the Illuminati loudly, a conspiracy about the left that the president has been retweeting. I was sitting across from them in the last row in front of the bathroom, and people pushed their bodies into my face while moving by with such pillow-like ferocity, such sparse apology, it was best to pretend it wasn't happening. It was like something Marina Abramovic might ask people to do to her. My first night in Homer, I dream there are flashlights beaming into the windows of the tiny house. My dream self tries to call my Airbnb host, then slinks down from the loft to see out the window that there are small monkeys, who are also the cast of a show I can't quite recall. I take pictures of them. A student recently explained that you're only allowed to write about dreams once in your writing life. I blurted back, "That's for fiction." This manuscript has become a grid of small white rectangles on my kitchen table. I've left space between some of the rectangles, and now I'm making collages to better visualize what those spaces might be for. Some might call this procrastination. I've cut around the billow of a pink explosion and layered it on top of a gray square. There's a jolt of blue alongside an oval made of cotton candy-hued beach sand. In Homer, I drive down the Spit, a stretch of land that curves like a sloppy spiral jetty into the bay, covered in bald eagles. I drive slowly, remembering the play I once saw in a red playhouse called The Electric Kool-Aid Antacid Test. It was like watching Christopher Guest live. There's an almost carnivalesque area with a disintegrating ship and piles of colorful ship stuff. Docks reach out into the bay. Long stretches of rocky beach, then sandy beach, then 2 rows of shops facing each other. A ferry terminal, a huge Chinese restaurant. You can buy art and candy and indigenous halibut hooks. I've spent 3 summers here with women I've dated without access or much access to a car. I marvel at how many miles we walked or biked to get to a tent or a cabin with no running water. Now I drive a compact rental car and stay in a tiny house that has been decorated with, I imagine, the guidance of Chip and Joanna Gaines. The floors are that gray-brown wood popularized by HGTV. There's a sconce with fake flowers. There's a small loft up a set of steep stairs. There's just enough room for a couch along the windows, punctuated by a small table. A heater that is meant to look old-timey lurks underneath the stairs. A bathroom beyond the kitchen with a bounty of clean white towels. I lay copies of Lorna Simpson paintings on the couch like an altar. All along the Spit, Sinatra sings When I Was 17 on the car radio. It's a very slow song, like an empty dance floor. It is lonely, and it supposes that 35 is the last point in this man's life he will ever feel young again. I feel all of my ages now, imagining those selves walking or biking along the water's edge. If I were going to choose a quotation to describe my relationship to this place, it would be this from Renee Gladman. I began the day asking the individuals of this group of my ex-lovers to map a problem of space, but not the problem that involved the anxiety of whether they could or could not draw, nor the one that asked how it was even possible to translate problems into lines. Rather, I meant real problems, where you had to think about where you were in a defined space and what your purpose was for being there. I just got a text from my ex-girlfriend today, so I thought it was kind of funny. I was like, I should read from Borealis. I asked out Kay, my college girlfriend, with a quote from the film Crossing Delancey. I crafted courtly emails in a rush of adrenaline to entertain my friends. On our first date, we drank sweet hot beverages at a quiet bar in our small Midwestern town. Someone was wearing cowboy boots. It was me. After the first night at her co-op, I woke to go to the printmaking studio, high off of her, living out a scene from the movie I had and had not imagined for my life. Rumpled sheets, morning light, and an empty art space. After we graduated, she moved to Alaska. Lived through a rose and slate-skied winter with her best friend in a cabin with no running water. She had a day job assisting a dog musher. We were on again, off again, and when she got a dog and named him after a tropical bird. I guess it annoys some people that I never say what the name was. I just say a dog named after a tropical bird. So I'm not going to tell you either. I moved home to California and had panic attacks, looping the golf course where sometimes I might jog past Dustin Hoffman. I looked at the ocean a lot and worked at a bookstore in a mall and cried constantly in the self-help section. I'd boarded a flight from Montana to Los Angeles when suddenly I got the idea to get off the plane and buy a ticket to Alaska. I kept unbuckling my seatbelt, thinking I would march down the gangplank, go up to the counter, and fly to Fairbanks. It was the middle of winter. I had no coat. The thin white man next to me turned slowly and asked if I was okay. I kept rising to disembark. For some reason, I told him everything. He listened calmly and suggested that my relationship with Kay was not contingent on me flying to Alaska on a whim. I flew back to my parents' apartment. I thought I might be a nanny in France and was saving money without making any plans. One day, after hearing a friend's roommate had moved out, I asked my manager if I could transfer to another bookstore and moved on a whim to Boston. When Kay invited me to spend the summer with her in Homer, we'd been on a long pause. It was a gorgeous depression of a winter. I walked to the bookstore, modeled with my clothes on for a drawing class near the alewife stop at the end of the Red Line, saw Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind in the theater. I was sleeping with a coworker who had freckles and the most delicious gap in her teeth. In Anne Carson's Kinds of Water, the speaker describes a pilgrimage along the road to Compostela. She writes about a river underneath her hotel window with a big waterfall. There is a dark shape at the edge of the falls as I look down, knocking this way, this is a quote, knocking this way and that, not in the force of the current. It would seem to be a drowned dog. It is a drowned dog. She goes back and forth about it. Could there be a sculpture of a drowned dog on the ledge of an ancient waterfall? The first time I read this passage, I felt quite positive it was about the time when I sat with Kay at a restaurant alongside a river in Fairbanks. There was no dead dog. The memory has a pleasant feeling, the gray sluice of water below, a strange trip so far into nowhere. It must be the sensation of coming to an edge and looking over. A fragment of afternoon from that time, we took a walk from a friend's cabin toward an intersection. I remember feeling the degree to which we were inland, like barometric pressure, a sensation at my sides. We were surrounded by a nostalgic version of the colors pink and green and yellow and light brown, like experiencing summer for the first time. A character in a TV show is named Prairie, and I keep imagining something about her is relevant here. We crossed a bridge between Homer and Fairbanks, where my girlfriend told me trucks had been knocked over by the wind. There was a moment in what I recall as silver light when I seemed to say to myself, Alaska, Alaska. There must have been moon then. We stood next to a car on the edge of a road between cities. Like eclipse, it would have been an off-glow. The dog, named after a tropical bird, would one day die on the night of a total eclipse. A short-legged black baby with ears like an art teacher's haircut who scream-sang at squirrels. Carson writes, the moon makes a traveler hunger for something bitter in the world. What is it? I will vanish. Others will come here. What is that? An old question. So I'm just going to read one little bit more. Lorna Simpson has been painting glaciers, human-sized, cataclysmic, eviscerated ice overlaid by a deep blue wash. Tumbling ash, full spectrum of gray, volcanic clouds, nothing whatsoever warm. I have long loved her photography, which is often paired with text and has an archival feel. Bodies of evidence laid out with numerical precision like slides on a light box. Every time I read that, I'm like, these are the days of our lives. Clinical amid a world of white space, whereas these paintings gut. They are unfurling and torn open. A wound before the blood comes. A Vogue article explains, nature hasn't looked this turbulent in a painting since J.M.W. Turner. According to my father, the ghost of J.M.W. Turner used to visit Gordon Parks. The dead painter sat on the edge of the dying photographer's bed and told him stories. Parks was writing a novel about Turner at the time called The Sunstalker. Robin Cost-Lewis uses the titles of paintings to create poems refracting the meaning of Black womanhood in her book, The Voyage of the Sable Venus. In class, I assigned students to mimic her approach, harvesting language from the titles of art. In my notebook, I reassemble words from paintings by J.M.W. Turner and call it an explanation for his appeal among Black artists. The battle of light and color, the decline of the burning of the modern, the shipwreck of Moses rising through vapor, the fighting peace, the burial of becalmed heaving, his mouth, the fighting, porch of the deluge, crossing the Alps of empire, rain, slave, and speed. Okay, I'm almost done. Okay. I first heard about Matthew Henson when an art professor showed us a sneak peek of the video True North, created by the conceptual artist Isaac Julian. Inspired by Julian's stark photographs of black skin against blue-white snow, I wrote about Matthew Henson's journey to Antarctica in a letter to my nephew, who had recently been put into solitary confinement. Something in me positioned the prison cell against the glacier, an immediate and insistent binary. I was newly discovering meditation and interwove the letter with stories from the Anapanasati Sutta about the Buddha's awakening. I wanted to give my nephew, proselytize, the sensation of space. The glacier made me feel as if I were on the very edge of the planet. One time I called it a jewel that adorned my quiet life. As if freedom of movement could be crystallized, cut and set into a ring. But ice is a lock, a container of suspended time. During a conversation with Fred Moten about the Black Outdoors, Saidiya Hartman talks about the effort to produce a thought of the outside while in the inside. She speaks of trying to produce an outside, trying to create an opening. After watching the movie Hancock, in which Will Smith sketches his life as a Greek god into the walls of his jail cell, I write in the letter to my nephew, I picture you on the floor of such a place, legs crossed beneath you, breath like an instrument enacting space and time into the surface of the cell. I quote a book by Jerry Ferris. When Matthew Henson first traveled to Iceland, he saw glaciers that looked like thick, flowing cream frozen into white walls. I imagined projecting photographs of a frozen landscape taken from above onto the corner of a room. I don't really sit on the floor, he wrote back. I read my nephew's first letter from solitary confinement while I was on a plane between Tucson and Detroit. I have this memory of pacing the aisle, taking pictures of the landscape to send him. I wrote, it seems impossible for the ground to be as red as it is, like cranberry juice or blood pooling in the cupped hands of a dust-brown valley. I've cut up a photograph of a falcon and placed it underneath an upside-down wildfire. There's a saguaro in the snow, fragments of a numerical equation. For months, I've been sitting on my nephew's most recent mailing, a collection of essays he's written over the last few years. In the first, entitled Degrees, he writes, how can I calm the waters? Give me the recipe to the remedy to a wildfire that stretches way beyond Cali. Set ablaze by society, instigated our temperaments, then asked why as an inside joke. A countdown behind our backs, they just waiting on us to blow, on standby for our demise. And I'm just falling into the trap, watching myself slip. Don't want to lose my freedom, but don't want to lose my sanity either. What's one without the other? Damn, that's like a car with no brakes, a climate with no rain, or snow all year round. He writes, Alaska being my only state of mind. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. I have a question to kick us off. I hope you have questions for each other, and then I hope you all have questions. But I can start us with a question, which is about something that appeared in both of the things you read, which is boredom. I'd love to hear you both talk about how to write about boredom in a way that isn't boring, and like what kind of a muse boredom is and what kind of an obstacle boredom is, or maybe the muse is the obstacle and the obstacle is the muse. It's just how you think about that term, and writing about what it feels like and deploying it as a tool in your own work.
I mean, one thing it brings to mind, I just remember this moment when I was thinking a lot about boredom, when I was living in Tucson and I was just so bored, but I feel like there was something kind of like alive behind it, you know, and it's like it feels very related to me to like meditation and to sort of like letting things sit so that you can kind of get past the chatter, you know, but there's something about it that feels like there's energy behind it, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I write about all these moments that I think maybe look boring, like my writing life, you know. But the experience of it is so not boring to me. It's like these slow, empty mornings of just sitting in front of a blank page and having nothing happen are so full of action for me, and they can also be like sapping of energy and unpleasant in various ways, but boredom kind of feels like the least of my problems. Like there's so many other problems. But I did want to circle back around to gleaning, and I noticed that that Aisha used the phrase harvesting language, you know, and that I think because you started with gleaning, that really caught my ear. And I was thinking about the way that, especially in writing this book, I felt like I was doing something like akin to gleaning. You know, gleaning is like taking the remains after the official harvest has been taken. You take what remains. And I was trying to work with these moments that were like almost like throwaway moments, and moments that weren't moments that seemed to be central action in life, but like a little phrase, or a little passing reference to something, or a little moment of discomfort. And the book was kind of to open that and see like what else could I make out of this little passing moment that might otherwise go in the trash or be forgotten, like that moment when my sister is like, this conversation is boring, you know. It's just a little aside, but for me it reminded me that I was like in a very like culturally specific fixation, and she was letting me know like, okay, you've gone a little bit too far down this rabbit hole, and for me that it was just a reminder of, oh, okay, so this, I could even make this a little performative on the page, like you know, to bring out even more of how myopic this particular new homeowner fixation is.
Yeah, I'm so interested in those moments when, just in what you just read and talking about calling attention to it to then do something to it, right? And I think that's, you know, I feel like in Borealis, there's this like boredom that accrues, right? And this like energy behind it that then like it becomes this like dialectic force, right? Like all this stuff, and then like the like oppressiveness of boredom that then kind of continue to kind of work together and press upon each other. So that's super interesting. Maybe we can talk about collaging and the commons. You talked a lot about, you read pieces about collaging just now, Aisha, from Borealis, but collage is something that's across your work. And there's this new book by this architect, Marshall Brown, who works in collage, and he just published a collection of his collages, his architectural collages, and he talks about collaging as honorific theft, and I just like that term. So I just wanted to hear more about collaging as a practice and as an ethos, and how that also, it seems to me in my brain, made me think about the commons and the way you're writing about the commons and your New Yorker piece. But I think there's like an interest in the commons, right? And just what you said about gleaning and how to kind of pay attention to the commons and what kind of a resource is the commons, but also not an untroubled resource. The commons is never a kind of pastoral place, right? And so, I don't know, something about collaging in the commons and how honorific theft may be a useful or non-useful way of thinking about those spaces. I don't know.
Cool question. I feel like you should start. Collage is your zone.
But the honorific theft, that's intense. Let me think.
Honorific theft. That is intense.
Well, I was just teaching a class last semester on collage where we were making collages and then reading. And you came to speak to that class.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really lovely, but at one point they asked me, so how do we cite the place where the images come from? And I was like, okay. I'm not sure how to answer that question. So I that's me just sort of coming up against the edge of that concept, I guess. And then, of course, I feel like when race comes into play in collage. It always gets really interesting and uncomfortable, and I feel like, yeah, we ended up talking, I think, about that question, and just what then sort of bringing it into writing and thinking about what we're extracting some of this language from. Yeah, and I feel like just thinking about the inherent violence to that, and yeah, just what it means to be working with those texts. I think I didn't sleep well last night, and I'm feeling that it's finally catching up to me today, so I might just pause there and see what you have
I'll
to say.
step into that. That's a great entryway for me. That phrase, honorific theft, just makes me think of how many things that are considered theft or illegal now, like before private property emerged as this dominant model, like in the time period, so medieval, early modern, when common pastures were still in use in England, there were a lot of activities that became illegal that were not illegal, and most of them involved people using things that didn't technically belong to them or taking things that didn't technically belong to them because they needed them. So there was this like ethos of necessity, really, and it was to, there was a whole intricate system of rights that commoners, so people who lived off the commons, had to land that wasn't under their ownership, and they were really rights of subsistence. They were rights to take what you needed to live, and so you could go into a forest that was owned by some aristocrat and take wood to heat your home. And you could fish in a stream to get food. Gleaning was one of these rights. So you could go into the pastures that weren't yours and glean the remains of the harvest. And I guess all those questions of necessity get more complicated and vexed when we start talking about art. And, do I need to steal something for my work? And is that theft different if I come from a group that's historically thieving from other groups? And I was thinking about this when Beyonce denied me some lyrics for this book. And how did I end up getting around that? Oh, I think I just paraphrased. Yeah. But lyrics are super, super complicated. It's way easier. You can take so much from poets. You can just quote endlessly, and you don't have to pay for it or anything. But lyrics are so expensive. I forget how much I paid, but it was in the thousands of dollars for lyrics for this book. But Beyonce just said no. There was like no amount you could pay Beyonce for her lyrics. And then, but there's all these people, various people are angry because Beyonce lifted things or borrowed things for her art. And I think those little rights conversations are really interesting, but also very depressing to me, I guess. I guess I want to believe in a like artistic commons, and but I think maybe there's something a little idealistic about that doesn't take into account like the real politics of the moment.
Yeah.
I could ask one more question. Maybe we should just open it up. Oh, great.
I have a question for you, Eula. You wrote a cover version of Goodbye to All That by Joan Didion.
Oh, yeah.
You basically sampled her from the essay. What connected those purloined fragments was your own sort of honoring her and inverting, almost arguing with her. And I just wanted to ask about that in this context of gleaning.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting comparison. And it was, you used the phrase cover version, it was exactly that. Like at the time, I just left New York for California, and I was reading Goodbye to All That, which is Didion leaving New York for California. She went back, though. And I was just arguing with it so much. I was reading it and I was like, I love this, I hate this. It's like her experience in New York was just nothing like my experience in New York. And a friend of mine who is a musician was like, well, why don't you just rewrite it? And I was like, yeah, no, that's plagiarism. And he was like, no, musicians do this all the time. You do your take. You take, what you appreciate about the song and you reinterpret it. And so it really does, like the idea behind that rewriting did for me come from musical practice, and was a kind of similar combination of like homage and there's a whole lot in here that I want to argue with or correct or change. My original idea totally did not work, which was I was going to keep the syntax of her. This exposes how little I knew about writing at the time. I was going to keep the syntax of all of Didion's sentences, but just change the content to match my experience in life. And I very quickly found that you can, content dictates syntax, and you cannot do that, is what I learned. There's a couple sentences still in that still are pretty close to Didion's syntax, but that was a huge disappointment to me because I thought the syntax was quite beautiful and I would have loved to preserve it, but it's fell apart. But there's that essay has been rewritten by enough writers that there's actually a whole anthology of Goodbye to All That essays. And it is kind of part of, I think, a tradition in writing of either lifting a title and writing into it, actually.
Well, Goodbye to All That is lifted.
It's lifted from Robert Graves. Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. So it's World War I memoir. Yeah. So yeah, I think I was also participating in that. And right now, John Breslin, who's sitting back there in the last row, he's involved in this exercise of rewriting Once More to the Lake. This is can be such a rich exercise for a writer, I think, is being in another writer's work but also making it your own. And I don't know what else to say about that other than it's such an educational experience. And it was for a while, at Northwestern, it was built into our pedagogy, actually. It was writing imitations. So that's how the intro level classes were really dedicated to writing imitations of another writer's work. And I had been trained actually in visual art that way. I'd been trained to we'd go to a museum and you'd copy a painting or a drawing. But I hadn't been trained in writing that way, so it was a really interesting thing to come into Northwestern and see, what that could do for you as a writer, what the limits are. I definitely met some student writers who were really, really good at imitation and then didn't know what to do outside of imitation. So it's there are limits to what that can do. But it's I found it an interesting space and mostly educational.
I mean, I have another question, just to follow up on the rewriting thing. I teach literature classes, and I often have my students do a rewriting exercise. So I taught a course on Richard Wright and Zora Hurston, and they had to rewrite something by Hurston as if Wright wrote it, or vice versa. So I'm just thinking about how helpful it is as a craft exercise, but it's also so helpful in terms of understanding choice, right? Or what to understand what writers are actually doing and to inhabit those choices in a way to ask, what is this choice, or what happens when you make this choice differently? So I feel like it's such a useful pedagogy for so many different kinds of things.
Yeah, it's really something. If you have to live in someone else's sentences, it's really it's an extreme intimacy with another writer.
I remember I had to do an imitation for a class, and I was doing that syntactic thing of just sort of switching out Mad Libs, the content, and my professor said, I don't understand how this is an imitation. And I was like, well, I did. I imitated exactly word for word, but I don't think that I got close enough to the impulse for the assignment when I did that. So.
But it's amazing how much, like, even when you switch out one word, keeping
Yeah.
the syntax,
Yeah.
you can change the entire texture of the sentence, or,
Yeah.
like, you can see it begin to fall apart in front of you. I learned so much about syntax from doing that.
Yeah.
Jen?
I was really interested in the voice of your nephew and in the, let's say, the delicacy. I mean, the nephew had written essays, but they weren't really cited, but there was citation present throughout the whole piece. And so I thought I would ask you about that in terms of this kind of like honorific theft of Marshall Brown. Seemed, well, you included his response to like not really sitting on the floor, which seemed like a, okay, get real kind of thing. Like, I'm not living in a movie. But yeah, I just was wondering how you thought about that, because that seems like a really delicate thing to represent, and like whether there are citations. I don't, in pieces of this that you didn't read.
Well, I think I cite the title of the essay that I was quoting in the same way that I do other authors throughout, so I'm not sure what the distinction would be there, but I mean, I talked with him about the book and asked for his permission to use that quote. So, but I mean, I think that there is a lot of delicacy in bringing his experience into my writing, for sure, and it's not necessarily something I feel at all kind of resolved about, but honestly, I keep trying to collaborate with him, and that's like the project that I pitch the most, honestly, to publishers, and it's really hard to get someone to agree to that. But a lot of the work, like, I think this is sort of an attempt to bring our voices together in a collaborative way, that I've been sort of hoping for in sort of a larger project. We've been sort of imagining what that would look like. We've talked about we've tried to do kind of like writing scenes back and forth to each other. We've imagined a lot of different kinds of books that we could do. Yeah, so it's a question that I'm constantly thinking about, and I think that sort of bringing our letters into this book and our sort of correspondence is sort of a gesture to that hope that at some point we can kind of just fully collaborate. But I think some of that is like, I don't know, related to just ancestral healing and just the fact of accepting that we're in different places in the world and that there are things about that I can't fix even by publishing a collaborative book with him. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like pain behind that question, I guess.
Can I be a hog and ask another
Please.
one for Aisha? So I read Capturing the Archives last night in one sitting, and what really struck me about the book is that a lot of the conversations are not actually about the photograph at all. Your dad just like starts telling another story. And I wanted to ask you about editing it, because what I loved about the book was that it was really like a 10,000 page book, but it had to be only a couple hundred pages long. And how do you do that? How do you make it clear that this is a 100,000 page book without making it a 100,000 page book? And how do you decide, which of these stories to let run away from the ostensible subject, which seemed to be really, in a way, almost the point of the book?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I would have been comfortable with a 10,000 page version of that book, just because, I mean, I tried to kind of, we had this idea for the book that it was kind of like the backwards version of what you were described with writing Having and Being Had, where we started out thinking very seriously about it, and then we would try to talk about one picture, and my dad would just shoot off in another direction, and so we would have these arguments, and then I started transcribing the arguments, and I was like, and then I read it to my dad, and we were just laughing, and I was like, I think this is the book. And so part of it was just sort of capturing our conversations, and he just has, I feel like I've always traced my own essayistic impulses back to him because he's so associative, but he also has this kind of feeling like things connect, like he really has this belief in synchronicity. And so I feel like leaning toward sort of like the thing you don't know you're looking for, and then sort of like writing toward that is something that I've always attributed to him. And so in these captions, I really wanted to capture that kind of sensibility and like worldview. So I had to allow for those big leaps, but I also did exclude a lot that is, yeah, I mean, also interesting to think about in terms of like reverse theft, I guess, the sort of like, I mean, you know, or stealing him the opportunity of that sort of like full, expression. But there's, I mean, yeah, part of it too is just, there's multiple other projects we would love to do together and be interesting to.
Like the sense I got was the more I learned about your dad, the more I realized I would never know all there is to know about your dad. And that's actually like a really hard thing to capture.
Yeah.
To give the reader more and more and make them feel like they know less and less, but they want more and more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel similarly about my dad. And I think too that's sort of like kind of related to what we were talking about earlier with regard to what isn't said. Like there's something self-protective about that conversational strategy that I've noticed in him. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I loved the Dr. Seuss piece that you read today, and I actually, when the book first arrived for me, I opened it immediately to that, but that was the very first piece I read, and there's just like so many huge debates that are gestured at within that one page about like racism, what kind of racism, like was Dr. Seuss a racist, what is racism anyways, did people consider rap racist at one point, like you're like, not now, Dad, but it's, and just like so many like transgressions too, including the reading of the mail and then the like finding out the racist thing that the colleague had said, and it's a wonderfully, amazingly compressed piece that gestures in so many different directions, and then leaves you with all those things to think about, and the photograph in front of you with the blow up bunny?
Yeah, it's like, or elephant or something. Yeah. Yeah, he's really funny. I like that. He really did. That was a very earnest end to the piece where he said, well, what business did I have looking for his mail? He's good at concluding things sometimes, if he gets to the end.
Thank you all for sharing your work. This was my first time hearing either of your writings, and it was a powerful experience. I felt like both the narrators were finding very deep things all the time in a large number of different places all at once. Things like race relations, like subtleties of race relations in a small object, and then or a single interaction, and then another interaction, and then a memory, and it all was kind of spiraling, and it kind of gave me the sense that like everything could be found in a single life. Like, at the same time, I wonder what your views are on the possibilities for action that those narrators saw, or those characters saw. Because it seemed like there was something very epic in the way that things were playing out in their minds, but yeah, it was hard for me to see what kind of coherence they were creating with what they were doing.
Yeah. I'll go first.
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, and I mean, my first impulse is to say, like, I think I was pretty aware of this already when I was writing this book, that it's not a book of action, like or all the action is in the realm of thought, like it's reflective action. So in almost every single one of these works is me, like I said, revisiting a moment and then thinking into it. And so that feels like what I'm enacting or acting out on the page is like this a second look or a depth of reflection or something like that. And I do think that frustrated some readers. Like I did see that in reviews, like that it's like this whole book about capitalism and other issues, and people were like, but what are we supposed to do? And the book definitely does not answer that question. It's not and so reader, here's the action to take next. Should you want to solve capitalism? But that was like, that was never the project. I never kind of had it in mind that this was a book that would engage in that sort of action or point towards that sort of action, or I mean, nor is it a book that has any kind of plot action in the conventional sense. There's like no plot except the movement of the author's mind, which is like how a lot of essays work, actually. It's not unusual for an essay to be without action entirely and without plot, except for the movement of the writer's mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for this piece, part of the inspiration for it, as I mentioned earlier, is this Georges Perec book, An Attempted Exhausting of Place in Paris, which is very spare and feels very similar to me to like a John Cage kind of composition, in that it's just drawing your attention to what's happening, and potentially, if you really can sort of be in that moment, finding the beauty in those sort of sounds. And so I do think that there is sort of a action underneath the inaction, but I also hear the ways in which that's not a satisfying answer to what you're saying. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'm more curious to study people who know how to act instead of write. I don't know. I think that's a very difficult question to resolve. But one thing I am puzzling over relating to the question about my nephew that I just thought about, that I kind of wanted to bring in, is just I don't cite his name, and I think the reason I don't use his name, I have used his name before, is I think there's something sort of protective in me. His pen name is in the book. It's dedicated to him, but I don't want people to look up what he did. And I think there's no way of knowing that people won't do that. And I think that's part of the citational kind of situation there. So I appreciate that question. And I don't think I had sort of answered it to myself until now. So thank you.
And that is the like exposure versus credit question is a really tricky one to answer. This was the first book that I wrote where I used people's names, and I had reasons for doing it, and that I then thought through again, and I was in some ways riffing on influences, including David Trinidad, a kind of second-generation New York school poet, and thinking about the kinds of camaraderie that are signaled by those poets using each other's names in their work. So I really was like, I thought into it. It didn't just happen accidentally. But in all my previous work, I've always anonymized people and most usually named someone in relationship to me, like my neighbor, my sister, my mother. And to try to create the maximum amount of anonymity for people. And I think I've not run into situations where I think people felt eclipsed or not credited, but I have run into situations where people felt overexposed. And I do think I probably will not do this again in terms of using people's actual names, because I think it's quite uncomfortable. And I know this from being written about, even just in like a newspaper article or something. Even when someone is writing in praise or believes they're writing in praise or thinks what they're writing is is positive in some way, it feels really uncomfortable to be written about, and it feels reductive, and I definitely understand that it's for a lot of people, it's very uncomfortable, and it doesn't feel like being credited, actually, which was also the spirit in which I was using people's names, was a spirit of credit. You know, all these people in this walk into this book, and I say, what is capitalism to them? And they answer in various ways. And I wanted to credit these interesting answers that come from various people. But I think for a lot of them that it didn't feel great. It didn't feel like credit.
Yeah, I know. There's like a Publisher's Weekly kind of description of this book that sort of calls attention to the fact that I name one ex-girlfriend, which I'm just using the letter, and then the other is unnamed. And yeah, I definitely feel like I was playing with anonymity as a stylistic kind of choice, but also I was like, she really wouldn't want me to even gesture at her name, but yeah, that's another interesting problem to play with.
Yeah, it makes, again, come back to honorific theft. It's like, how does that line between honor and theft or exposure move? And it's so contextual, and you think you know it, and then it moves here. And yeah, it's interesting. Okay, we are at time, so thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks for the conversation.